This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Welcome to Dark Minds, Shattered Lives, where we expose predators, dive into the minds of evildoers, and help you and your loved ones avoid them. I'm your host, Deborah Dobbs. I'm an author and victim advocate with a reputation for rattling cages. I think it's safe to say that anyone in law enforcement, crisis response, or victim advocacy has at least one call or case that haunts them. As a victim advocate, my job required me to respond to the scenes of crimes or crises and involved anything from making death notifications to arranging for crime scene cleanup. I witnessed a lot of disturbing behavior and the immediate aftermath of violence. That kind of work has been described as having a front row seat to human suffering, and I spent about 15 years doing it. But the call that haunts me the most was my first. Now, if you read my debut novel, The Psychotic Son, you might recall the blue-eyed girl who confronts and then haunts the main character, victim advocate Colleen Heenan. The child's words, "You lied to me," echo in Colleen's mind. The little girl appears in Colleen's dreams throughout The Psychotic Son and again in Vile, my second novel in the series. If you're one of my readers, you also know that while my stories are indeed fiction, they are inspired by real events. It's fairly common with authors. The interaction with the blue-eyed child is one of those events. Because so many of my readers from similar professions related to the scene, I decided to share the truth that inspired that fiction. Although the incident happened more than 20 years ago, I'm protecting the confidentiality of the victims by changing their names. As for the location of the crime, I'll leave it as a city in north central Texas. I won't describe in detail the acts of violence that occurred that day, but the content is intended for adults, so listener discretion is advised. I don't remember what year it was, but obviously I was new to the job since it was my first call. It was my first crisis call on my own. I believe it was August because I remember the oppressive Texas heat. At that time, the agency I worked for was led. I'm being generous by using the word led by a woman who did little to prepare her victim advocates for the work. Nowadays, victim advocates typically are licensed professional counselors or social workers. Back then, though, a lot of victim advocates had little to no formal training. Many were survivors of domestic violence or parents of murdered children. The victims' rights movement had taken hold across the nation, but many of the advocates were volunteers with, people with great fortitude, driven by passion and pain. Without a license to lose, the old school advocates could ruffle feathers. Mothers Against Drunk Driving didn't evolve without rattling some cages. I remember going to a conference, and one of the speakers, she was fired up, and she told the advocates in the room that we needed to stop bitching and start being bitches. That was how they got stuff done, because for a long time, victims would, if they're waiting to testify, they would be sitting out in the hallway with the suspects and their families. It was dangerous. It was scary. And that was just one of many things that victims would endure. They'd be completely left out of the system as far as what was going on with prosecution efforts or what was going on with their cases in general. They would have no participation in plea agreements and nobody standing up for them. So that's what the victim advocates did. And it wasn't easy. We weren't always popular, but things have really changed. And that's okay. But let's go back to that time where I had some training, but not much. Now, I didn't get into the work because of any experiences I had, although I did have some. That didn't drive me to getting into that kind of work. I got into the work through my mother. She was a volunteer advocate at that nonprofit agency, and she lured me in. I'd recently graduated with a master's degree in sociology, but most of my coursework had fallen under criminology and criminal justice. But I learned I had less interest in theories about why people did bad things than I had in helping their victims recover. I really liked that idea. I liked the idea of rattling cages. I had a part-time position as a college instructor that failed to cover my living expenses, not even close. So I convinced the boss at the nonprofit to take me on as a contractor. So the boss, let me tell you about her. She arrived every day in her fancy car. I think it was a Jaguar. In winter, she wore fur coats. She fancied herself a therapist, yet she lacked the education or license to practice as a mental health professional, although that did not stop her. Our organization had a contract with a local police department to meet the spirit of the law rather than the mere letter regarding victims' rights. It was a great mission, but I would soon learn it was difficult to fulfill because my boss had developed a contentious relationship with patrol officers and investigators and most of the brass at the department, although she and the corrupt police chief were thick as thieves. So there I was, a brand new victim advocate, completely ignorant of the dynamic between my boss and the police department, and my boss has just advised me to go to the police department to respond to a crisis call. I was told to sit with 2 children whose mother had been stabbed to death right in front of them, and it was a domestic violence murder, so the killer was the father of one or both of the children. Paramedics had taken the mom to the hospital, which had given her children false hope. They did not know their mother was dead, and I was not permitted to tell them, which was fine with me, because that news should not come from a stranger. It should come from loved ones, and I was told that loved ones were on their way. I remember wondering why we couldn't bring the kids to our location. We operated out of a house right across the parking lot from the police department. Our house, it was pretty run down, but we had comfortable places to sit, plenty of space, snacks, toys, and games. Instead, I was told to keep the children at the police department in the youth crimes division. That's where I would find them. As a new person, I didn't argue. I figured there must be a good reason. So I headed to the station, feeling nervous and a little sick. I had crisis intervention training, and I had been on a few call-outs with my mom. She showed me the ropes, but none of the training or these crisis calls had involved children. And these children were only 3 and 5 years old. When I arrived, the kids were sitting on the carpet in a little nook of sorts in an area separating the youth crimes division from the other investigation units. The kids were wearing tank tops and shorts that might have been sleepwear. I looked at their tiny bare feet and remembered how infrequently I'd worn shoes at their ages. Bare feet meant school was out for summer. Bare feet signaled fun and freedom, but they didn't look right in a police station. I glanced around the little space and saw a few children's books that had seen better days and a small activity table with a sparse collection of Legos. I introduced myself and asked them what they liked to be called. I figured with so much out of their control, they should at least have the choice of how to be addressed. They let me know that the boy's nickname was Bubba, but that only family members called him that. So I referred to them as they wanted, as Lisa and Christopher. Immediately, they asked me if their mom was okay. I manipulated the truth. I knew she was taken by an ambulance to a hospital, and I said that the doctors were doing all they could to help her. I used the present tense. It was also a vague answer, which was not what the children needed, and it was a lie. And it was a lie. At that time, I had no idea how many times I would repeat. During our first few minutes together, I learned that Lisa and Christopher were half-siblings who shared a mother. I noticed that Lisa was protective of her little brother. We talked about pets. I read them a book. And then they asked about their mother again. And I told them I didn't know anything new. And then I called the office to talk to the boss. I found a phone. In relation to the kids, I was out of earshot, but not out of their sight. I placed the call, and the receptionist at the agency answered. She told me that the maternal grandparents had been notified. So that's the children's mother's parents. They had been notified and they were en route. So was Lisa's father. They were coming from opposite directions, but all should arrive within a couple of hours. And then I could take the children to the center to reunite with loved ones and learn the devastating truth. I returned to Lisa and Christopher, who were huddled together, and I let them know that family was coming, and this seemed to lift their spirits. But I knew that 2 hours would feel like forever. It wasn't long at all before a detective popped in and said she needed to talk to the kids individually. So now I understood why we were at the station. This detective was oddly chipper and clumsy with her words, like she didn't spend much time with children. But neither did I, and maybe I was equally clumsy and didn't even realize it, and I certainly felt clumsy. The detective asked to talk to Christopher first, and when they left the room, Lisa again asked me about her mother, like maybe I'd cough up some information now that her little brother was gone. I told her I didn't know anything new. I'm not sure if she believed me. Lisa then told me she and her brother were hungry and cold, which made sense. If you live in the South, you know how we tend to set the thermostat so low in the summers, especially if we're not the ones paying the electric bill. That Arctic blast is a welcome reprieve from the heat initially, but it doesn't take long before you're in need of a sweater. And then I remembered hearing something about the kids thinking they were going to McDonald's for breakfast, so they hadn't even eaten. So of course they were hungry, and of course they were cold. So I looked around while keeping an eye on Lisa. I also spotted a youth crimes detective, and I got his attention. And he went on the hunt for snacks and something to keep the kids warm. And when he left, the youth crimes area was empty. I mean, there was no one there. Then it dawned on me how few personnel were around at all. I peered into the Capers unit, the Crimes Against Persons, or some people call it Major Crimes unit. And I didn't see a soul in there either. It was eerily quiet. Now, other than a brief tour of investigations, I hadn't spent much time up there before, so maybe this was normal. I had to consider that. I'd been completely focused on distracting the kids while not even thinking about the other half of the equation, the boy's father, the killer. Not once had his son asked about him. I had so many questions. Had he been arrested? Was he in the jail below us? Was he on the run? Did that explain the empty chairs at the detectives' desks? The department was small compared to cities like Dallas and Houston, and when something big like this happened, it could mean all hands on deck. The detective returned with Christopher, and she was still her upbeat self, and she advised me, he likes to be called Bubba. And off she went with Lisa. And Christopher looked at me and asked, is my mom okay? I just said, I'm sorry, Christopher, but I don't know anything new. I wanted to puke. Desperate to change the subject, I reminded him his grandparents were on their way. And then we played with Legos while we talked about his grandparents, what he called them, what I called mine, what they looked like. I told him about my grandparents' dairy farm. I had few positive interactions with my farmer grandparents, but I'd talk about anything to avoid the question, is my mom okay? Conversations with 3-year-olds don't tend to last long, and once again I sensed the emptiness around us. I had no idea then what was going on outside our little nook. In fact, until I started writing this episode, I never really knew what was happening while I was lying to the victim's children. But Wayne Dobbs, a retired detective, can shed light on that. Dobbs, you heard that right, and it's not a coincidence. Wayne Dobbs is my husband now. But back then, we didn't know each other at all. I knew who he was. Everybody did. Dobbs was a big Texan, earning the name Monster when he'd attended the police academy. He had a deep voice and a booming laugh, but he had piercing eyes, and he could come off pretty intense. Sometimes civilians called to complain about him for being mean, and when asked for something a little more specific, they'd say, well, he just looked at me mean. When I was working on this episode, I asked him what he remembered about the crime, if anything. Well, he remembers a lot because he responded to the scene. He was a detective working in narcotics and intelligence at the time. He was also working a secondary assignment as a crisis negotiator. It was a unit that was attached to SWAT. And the day of this call, Dobbs and the other people on the team, the crisis negotiation team and SWAT, were on a training day. There was 4 or 5 of them, in addition to a sergeant on the team. Now, a crisis negotiator is often what people think of as a hostage negotiator. This team might be called in when the police go to arrest a suspect and the suspect fires shots and essentially barricades himself inside his house or whatever structure he's in. And the crisis negotiator may be the line of communication between an offender and the SWAT team. Sometimes a crisis response team or crisis negotiation team will come when they have a suicidal person who's barricaded him or herself inside a home or a business. Rarely was there actually a hostage involved. That's why they quit calling them hostage negotiators. The point was to provide some communication, bring down those emotions, kind of trigger that thinking brain again, bring logic back into the equation. And a crisis negotiator, hopefully, can bring forth a resolution in which the police, the offender, and anyone in the surrounding area avoids getting hurt or killed. So Dobbs and his team were at the training station. It was a substation. They were just getting settled in when they got the call. They got a call from dispatch. At the time they got the call, it was early in the day, and they were told it was an attempted murder of a woman at an apartment complex that was only about a mile away from where they were. The suspect in the attempted murder had barricaded himself in the apartment and was refusing to respond to patrol. So they needed the crisis negotiation team on the scene. So the team arrives at the apartment complex, and there they learned that the suspect and his estranged wife were supposed to meet for a custody exchange so that one of the 2 children could have a visit with the father, and that the exchange was supposed to take place at McDonald's. They knew that the children and their mother headed out to the car. Perhaps the kids climbed inside, but they obviously never made it to McDonald's. The suspect was there. There was an argument, and the suspect produced a knife, and Dobbs remembered that the suspect was said to have stabbed the woman over a dozen times. In the torso and the legs. It was incredibly violent. And he did it in the presence of the children. And then he ran into what they believe was his apartment. So apparently he had an apartment at this location. It doesn't explain why there would be an exchange at McDonald's. We are remembering what happened. We haven't pulled the report, so some of this just doesn't make sense. But what we know for certain is that this man killed a woman, a mother, in front of her children. So the crisis negotiation team is there, and they're trying to make contact with this suspect using bullhorns. They tried to call, and the guy is not responding. Now, at this point in time, we had cell phones, but we did not have smartphones. We had the old flip phones, so it was much more common to be calling people's landlines rather than cell phones. So you have people on the crisis response team that are trying to reach the offender, and there are also others doing research, gathering intel. It might involve calling family members in some situations, employers, maybe coworkers to get some information about the person. It'll also involve looking into criminal history. This guy didn't happen to have any criminal history, but based on the violence that he inflicted, I highly doubt this was his first time to be violent. It was just the first time he was caught doing it. When this kind of thing goes on long enough where an offender just refuses to respond, some crisis negotiators decide to change tactics. But that depends on the type of negotiator. And because Wayne Dobbs was a negotiator, I've asked him to explain it for himself. Were there different types of crisis negotiators?
Yes, there were and are. There are some, I call them the true believers, that believe that if they can talk to someone long enough and work on them long enough and be involved in the process, that they will eventually get this individual who is barricaded to go ahead and come out and surrender to the police. The other type is probably has a more practical approach or a more tactical approach even, in that they approach negotiation with a suspect from a point of resolving the matter as safely and as quickly as possible for the innocent people involved in it. And they will look at the situation as one where if the person is completely violent, evil, awful, however you want to characterize them, they will be willing to negotiate and manipulate that individual into a position where the police can take a tactical action on them, whether it be a hostage rescue, breaking the door and going in and confronting the person at gunpoint, or in real extreme situations, maneuvering them to a position where a sniper can take them out.
And what type would you say you were?
I was very practical. I didn't want anybody to get hurt, but I also realized that the longer things went on, the more chances there were for a misunderstanding or a mistake to take place on either side or both sides. So it was one of those things of, let's resolve this as quickly as possible within the standard restraints of the law and taking care of innocent people involved in it.
So in this case, he wasn't responding. So what action did you take?
The SWAT team leader directed me to go and look at and find an apartment that was laid out like the suspect's apartment was. So I contacted the apartment management. They took me to a vacant apartment that was exactly the same floor plan. And as soon as I walked in the door and looked at it from a panoramic view, I knew that it was going to be very high risk because there were too many openings or portals in the design. There were hiding places. There were a multitude of angles from which a hidden suspect could launch an attack on officers entering. I made a quick sketch of it and went back to the team leader and told him that it was very, very hazardous situation as far as the layout.
Large police departments like Dallas and Houston will have SWAT teams and crisis negotiation teams that maybe that's all the employees do, like these officers do. That's their only role at the department. It's a full-time job. But that's not the case at this department. This smaller department, like many small departments, have SWAT teams and crisis negotiators. And the people on those teams are doing it in addition to their full-time assignment. So this explains the lack of people that were up in investigations that day. They were at the scene either ready to take action on the SWAT team or trying to get this suspect to respond. And he would not respond. And Wayne Dobbs knew he wasn't going to respond. But because now Wayne had the sketch of the apartment, if and when the SWAT team went into the apartment, they weren't going in blind. They would know all the nooks and crannies and where a suspect could be hiding in case he wanted to go down with guns a-blazing. And unfortunately, in this case, he had plenty of places to hide. Meanwhile, I was back at the station. Lisa had returned, and she and Christopher were eating Jell-O cups while shivering underneath thin police windbreakers, and I was on the phone again, getting bad news. The grandparents had indeed arrived, but they weren't ready to see the children yet. And I had to remind myself how much pain they must have been in. Now that I am a mom, I can only imagine what that must feel like. All is wrong in the world when you're faced with bearing your child, no matter their age. Still, I made a case for them to reconsider. The children were asking about their mom, and they were cold and confused, scared, and they were hungry. Jell-O cups were not going to cut it. And we had multiple rooms available at the house where we worked. At the very least, could someone please go pick up a Happy Meal or something for the kids? But my pleas fell on deaf ears. It felt like a sick sort of power play between me and the boss. I was a 20-something who was still getting my footing. My 50-something self would have handled the situation quite differently. But I did make a command decision. I got the receptionist to give me the number for our agency's children's therapist so I could ask her for some guidance. Her name was Suzanne, and she was a contractor who had a private practice, so she wasn't on site much. I'd only met her once or twice, but she was unforgettable. She was radiant and had kind eyes, and she was calming, and she had a soothing laugh. After I told her what was going on, she said she'd just come. She'd be there right away. Occasionally, after the detective had interviewed the kids and they were no longer needed at the station, people would stop by, kind of glance in at us and have a look like, why are you still here? So Suzanne arrived and just provided this enormous relief to me. I know she was comforting for the children, but she was equally as comforting to me. It wasn't long after Suzanne had arrived that another person showed up. This was a very no-nonsense person. I found out she was a captain. She had no idea who I was. She put it together who the children were. Like the other detective that was there, she wondered why we were still there. At that point, it made no sense. The police department is not a place for little kids to be hanging around, especially after what these children had gone through. It just seemed mean. So she asked me, why are you still here? And I told her exactly why, and that I thought it was a good idea for us to go back too. We agreed on that. And at that point, she could pull rank when I could not. So there's like this windowed office adjacent to the little nook I was in. And that is where the captain placed a phone call. So I could hear her. And she made two things abundantly clear. One was that she did not like my boss at all. That was abundantly clear. And the other was that she was in charge. And I have to admit that after being dismissed for so many hours and just withholding this information from the children, when I heard the tone of voice she used and just basically the declaration that we were leaving, it was glorious. I felt like we had been rescued, like we were hostages, finally being released. Over time, I knew that my boss had a bad reputation, and I understood why. But back then, I thought, well, maybe it was an isolated animosity between these two. So decades later, I asked Dobbs to give me some insight. He'd been there a lot longer than I had. Okay, Wayne, what was going on that I did not know?
That no one in the police department at the line level trusted her because she divulged confidences that were stated during counseling session with officers. We were led to believe by her actions that she was, in fact, a licensed therapist.
Nowadays, you can go online and search for verification of someone's licensure. But back then, you couldn't do that. And when the chief of police tells an officer, you're going to go over and talk to this counselor, it's kind of an order. And it's not unreasonable to believe that when somebody refers to her as counselor, that she is indeed a licensed counselor, like a licensed professional. That's what was implied. And a licensed professional counselor must keep confidences with certain exceptions. But those exceptions are made very clear from the get-go. But if you don't have a license and you violate confidentiality, there's really no recourse. At least there wasn't back then. It wouldn't be long before I learned that my boss and the chief of police, he's long gone. He's been gone for decades. Anyway, the two of them had this really twisted game they were playing. They acted like they didn't like each other. My boss pretended that she just held the chief in contempt. But what she was really doing was serving as a pipeline of information for officers who were referred to her. Maybe it was to debrief after a really difficult call. Maybe they're going through a divorce or something, and the chief would order them to go talk to her, this woman who posed as a therapist. And then she would just give the information right back to him, right back to the chief. So you have this overall mistrust between the police department and my boss. And then you have her overstepping and imposing on them by refusing to let me and the children and now Suzanne leave the department. But there was also something else that was going on that had just happened that might have contributed to the captain's intensity. Again, I had no idea what was happening at the time, but Dobbs can explain it to you now. He was there. So you're back at the scene, and you've gathered some intel, and there were some decisions to be made.
So we knew he had a knife. We knew he had been violent that day. We knew that he wouldn't communicate in any form or fashion. He wouldn't acknowledge any attempts to speak with him. We knew we had a hazardous layout, and this had gone on for several hours with no contact with him at all. And based on that, a decision was made to enter the apartment where he was hiding out.
Was your gut telling you anything?
Gut wasn't telling anything. We had explored the possibility that he was laying in wait. We explored the possibility that he was dead, had committed suicide. Something that didn't get talked about, but it's happened on enough standoffs in the past with virtually every team that's had very many standoffs. is there's a third possibility that he had escaped during the process and was currently at large. That happens more than people want to talk about in that world of tactical operations. And usually what it is you have a flex time or a time of flux where you have formed the belief or have information that someone's inside a structure, and there have been gaps of visibility and attention and surveillance on the site while you get the manpower in place or while you relieve patrol and get SWAT in place, etc. There's so many gaps that can be there, and it's not as common during the day as it is during the night when they can use the cover of darkness to cover their escape. But there's always the possibility that the guy wasn't in there after all. We don't talk about those very much because they're embarrassing. So SWAT made entry. They used a barrier bunker, a shield that you move along in front of personnel to absorb bullets in case the bad guys shoot at you. And they went in and made a search, and they found this suspect dead in the apartment.
And where exactly did you find him?
He was in a position that indicated he had laid an ambush. He was hidden between the back of a sofa and a wall in the living room to where he would have had a direct shot at the front door when the entry was made. And apparently what happened is he lay there long enough and thought about things long enough and realized what the final conclusion was going to be no matter what. And he killed himself. He killed himself by shooting himself, and which led me to believe he had a gun with him that didn't get put in play when she got killed.
The captain's intensity might have been ratcheted up by the fact that the suspect had been lying in wait, waiting for people that were likely this captain's friends, no doubt her colleagues. He was waiting to murder them. At the time, I didn't know this new information. I just knew that Captain was in no mood for bullshit, and I was relieved that we were finally going to be leaving the station and going to a better environment. But I was also sad to know the reality that was waiting for these sweet kids. When Lisa and Christopher heard we were finally leaving and we were going to see their grandparents, they were excited, and the anticipation of the reunion distracted them from the unknown. By then, it was afternoon, and stepping outside was like stepping into an oven. The sun was glaring, and the concrete was searing hot. We had to carry the kids to protect their bare feet. And Suzanne picked up Christopher, and I picked up Lisa, and they both giggled as we carried them to the house. And I wondered how long it would be before they laughed again. Once inside, at our office, inside that house, there was a brief greeting, and then I sat at the table with the kids as they ate yogurt and some other hearty snacks that we had on hand, and they asked me to draw with them while Suzanne and the boss met privately with the grandparents. And then Lisa and Christopher joined them, and they learned their mother was dead. Children can sit with bad news and big emotions for a limited time. They might react to devastating news as expected, with sadness and confusion, and then switch gears in an instant. Adults might be baffled by a child's sudden eruption of silliness. Regardless of age, we all have a pain threshold, though, and we activate the coping skills we've been taught or acquired along the way. So Lisa and Christopher returned to the table with me and continued their drawing almost like nothing had happened. Lisa wrote her name at the bottom of her artwork, and then she gave it to me along with a big hug. I glanced at Christopher's drawing, scribbles of orange on manila paper. My gaze filled to him, and I was going to tell him I thought his art was really nice, but his big blue eyes locked onto mine, and I could see he had something to say. He looked right into me and said, "You lied to me." And my throat tightened, and I felt my heart pound inside my chest. I told him he was right, and that I was sorry. There was nothing else to say, but I'm sorry. And the grandparents left with Christopher, and Lisa's father arrived and took her home with him. And these tight-knit siblings went to live in homes hours apart. I imagine Lisa and Christopher grieved the loss of their mother, but also the loss of each other. Christopher had the added grief of growing up without his mother or his father. I don't know what happened to any of them. And the not knowing is painful. And then the knowing that on what was likely the worst day of this little boy's life, I played the role of a liar. That is also painful. I had gone into victim advocacy to help people, to help victims know their rights and have them respected, to connect them with resources, to be a bridge between them and mental health services that would help them heal from trauma, and to listen when everyone else was too tired to. But with this case, I didn't do any of that. And when I think of the case, 20 years later, I see that little boy's face and his blue eyes, and I hear his voice so clearly saying, "You lied to me." The killer in this case had no criminal history, but that doesn't mean he had not engaged in violence before. Lethal violence, especially against an intimate partner, rarely springs up out of nowhere. There are signs, but you need to know what they are. You can visit the National Domestic Violence Hotline website to read these warning signs, plan for safety, and find help. Simply go to thehotline.org. Thank you for listening to Dark Minds, Shattered Lives. I'm Deborah Dobbs, and until next time, trust your gut and know your exits.